The morning light was just breaking over the rugged mountains as Lieutenant Olivia Chen stepped onto the dusty parade ground at Forward Operating Base Resolute. Her uniform hung loose on her slender frame, making her appear even smaller amid the towering soldiers of the 87th Mountain Division. At just 5 feet 4 inches and barely 115 pounds, she stood out like a misplaced civilian among the combat-hardened troops. But behind her quiet demeanor lay skills that would soon transform her from a commander's liability into the savior of an entire regiment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Another transfer from Support Command, muttered Colonel Blackwell, barely glancing at her paperwork. Tactical Communications Specialist, great. Another desk jockey who thinks she knows combat operations. Olivia remained silent as she hoisted her single duffel bag over her shoulder. Experience had taught her that first impressions at military bases were rarely changed by explanations or corrections. Her transfer papers contained exactly what they were supposed to contain: former communications specialist seeking field experience. What they didn't mention were the 3 years she'd spent working alongside elite special operations teams at a classified facility in the Northern Territories, where she developed unparalleled skills in ballistic calculations under extreme conditions. The base buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for upcoming operations. This was the front line of the conflict zone, and the 87th Mountain Division carried themselves with the confidence of troops who'd seen real combat. Major Reynolds, the operations officer with 25 years of service etched into his weathered face, barely acknowledged her when Colonel Blackwell introduced her. "Put her with the communications team," Reynolds said dismissively. "Let her monitor radio traffic and handle message encryption. Maybe she'll learn something useful by watching real soldiers work." Olivia nodded politely, mentally noting the casual dismissal. She'd heard it before. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a slight build, she didn't match anyone's image of what a combat operator should look like. The military had specific physical requirements for frontline designation, standards she could never meet. But expertise didn't vanish simply because regulations couldn't recognize it. Her assigned quarters were Spartan, a simple bunk, metal desk, and standard issue locker, while other soldiers decorated their spaces with photos and personal mementos. Olivia unpacked technical manuals on advanced ballistics, atmospheric conditions, and long-range targeting systems. These weren't standard issue publications. They were specialized texts filled with handwritten notes and precise calculations in her meticulous handwriting. "Planning to teach a college course or something?" asked Sergeant James Cooper, her bunkmate, eyeing the stack of technical books with obvious skepticism. Cooper embodied everything Olivia wasn't: tall, muscular, confident, and vocal about his accomplishments. He'd arrived with stories about his previous deployments and ambitions of joining elite sniper units. "Just like to understand how things work," Olivia replied quietly. "Already studying the weather patterns in this mountain region." Cooper laughed, the sound echoing in the small room. "Understanding and doing are completely different things. Wait until you're in the field with enemy fire coming at you. Theory doesn't mean much when you're trying to coordinate communications under fire at 10,000 feet elevation." Olivia almost smiled at that. She'd coordinated operations at elevations twice that high, calculating wind drift and atmospheric pressure, while special operations teams executed missions that never appeared in official reports. But she simply nodded and returned to her reading. The next morning provided her first glimpse of the division's operational intensity. The Mountain Combat Training Program was legendary throughout military circles. Units came from across the country to test their limits against the region's challenging conditions. The centerpiece of their training was a series of forward observation posts positioned at seemingly impossible distances across valleys and ridgelines. Only our best spotters can effectively direct fire at that range, declared Colonel Blackwell. As he briefed the latest group of arrivals, the colonel cut an imposing figure, silver-haired and stern, with campaign ribbons covering half his chest. We keep those ops active to test communication systems, but don't delude yourselves into thinking you'll ever coordinate effective fire support at those distances. Olivia stood at the back of the group taking detailed notes. Not about communication protocols, but about wind patterns, humidity changes, and ground stability factors. The officers assumed she was documenting procedures for administrative purposes. They had no idea she was analyzing environmental factors that affected long-range targeting with the precision of a meteorologist. During the first live-fire exercise, she was assigned to the communications center. While veteran operators coordinated fire missions at various ranges, Olivia monitored radio traffic, checked equipment, and maintained the communications log. But she also observed every call for fire, every adjustment, every environmental factor that influenced accuracy. She noticed things others missed: how temperature changes affected shell trajectories, how altitude influenced air density, how microscopic vibrations in targeting equipment could throw off even perfect calculations. "Hey, transfer girl," called out Lieutenant Rodriguez during the break. "Stop daydreaming and get back to work. These comms logs won't update themselves." Olivia nodded politely and continued her tasks. Rodriguez was typical of the officers here, competent but limited by conventional thinking. He'd achieved his position through solid fundamentals and good equipment. He'd never had to coordinate fire missions under impossible conditions. Never had to read atmospheric conditions like a native language because an entire team's survival depended on it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Don't take it personally," whispered Specialist Mira Patel, one of the few other women at the forward base. Mira was a medical technician who'd befriended Olivia during meal breaks. "Rodriguez thinks anyone without combat experience shouldn't be allowed near operations. It's nothing personal." "It's fine," Olivia replied, though she appreciated Mira's kindness. "I'm here to learn." But as the days passed, Olivia began to notice patterns that troubled her. Communications failures that shouldn't happen. Targeting calculations that seemed inexplicably off. Fire missions missing their marks despite proper procedures being followed. When frustrated, officers brought their complaints to the communications center. It was always Olivia they found diagnosing the issues. She had an uncanny ability to spot problems that stumped experienced technicians: slight signal degradations, microscopic calibration errors in targeting systems, inconsistencies in fire direction calculations. Skills that seemed supernatural to observers who didn't understand her technical knowledge. "How does she do that?" Cooper asked Lieutenant Rodriguez after watching Olivia identify a minor frequency variation that had been causing garbled transmissions all morning. "Lucky guess," Rodriguez replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Olivia said nothing. She'd learned these skills through necessity, working with special operations teams who conducted missions that pushed the boundaries of conventional warfare. When you were responsible for ensuring their communications functioned perfectly under extreme conditions, you developed an almost instinctive understanding of how systems behaved. Late at night, while others socialized or relaxed, Olivia studied meteorological data. She tracked how temperature changes affected radio propagation, how altitude influenced signal strength, how humidity created invisible barriers that could deflect both signals and projectiles. The other soldiers called her antisocial. The officers labeled her dedicated but limited. Nobody asked about her previous experience. Her transfer paperwork was routine, unremarkable. Former communications specialist seeking field experience. What they didn't know was that she'd spent 3 years making elite operators look legendary, providing the technical expertise that turned impossible missions into successful operations. But regulations were regulations. Without the proper physical qualifications, she'd never receive official recognition as a combat specialist. She was support personnel, invisible and unacknowledged, no matter how critical her contributions might be. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same system that created heroes often ignored the people who made those heroes possible. But Olivia had made peace with invisibility long ago. Recognition was less important than competence, and competence was something she possessed in abundance. As her first week at FOB Resolute ended, she felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. But she also sensed opportunity. The mountain's challenging conditions, the advanced equipment, the emphasis on long-range operations, all of it called to skills she developed in secrecy. Somewhere in the distance, those impossible observation posts waited. Only the best could effectively coordinate at. The regiment was building towards something significant. And when that moment arrived, she intended to be ready. Whether the officers appreciated her capabilities or not, the mountain winds whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of challenges ahead. In the distance, those impossible observation posts waited, a stark reminder of the limits everyone accepted. Everyone except Olivia Chen, who was beginning to understand that some limits existed only in the minds of those who'd never tried to exceed them. The mountain weather turned hostile in Olivia's 5th week at FOB Resolute. Heavy clouds rolled in from the east, bringing unpredictable winds and temperature swings that challenged even experienced operators. It was perfect weather for advanced training, but terrible weather for maintaining communications equipment. Olivia arrived at the communications center to find chaos. Overnight condensation had affected several high-precision radio systems, and the humidity was playing havoc with signal clarity. 3 separate units were showing transmission problems, and the morning's training schedule was backing up as frustrated operators waited for solutions. "Chun," Major Reynolds' voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Get these. Comms operational now. We've got VIP observers coming this afternoon, and I won't have equipment failures embarrassing this regiment." Olivia nodded and began her diagnostics, working with the focused efficiency that had become her trademark. The problems were complex but solvable: moisture infiltration in radio housings, thermal expansion affecting circuit boards, and atmospheric pressure changes influencing signal propagation. For someone with her background, these were routine challenges. But as she worked, she became aware of whispered conversations among the officers. Words like show off and overstepping boundaries drifted from their direction. Lieutenant Rodriguez in particular seemed agitated by her ability to solve problems that stumped more senior technicians. "She's making us look bad," she heard him mutter to Major Reynolds. "A communications grunt shouldn't be outperforming certified technicians." "Maybe she's just good at her job," Reynolds replied, though his tone was uncertain. "Or maybe she's hiding something," Rodriguez shot back. "Nobody transfers from a backwater assignment and immediately starts performing miracles. I want her background checked thoroughly." Olivia's hands never paused in their work, but her mind was racing. A background check would reveal her official record, which was exactly what it appeared to be: communications specialist with standard qualifications. But it might also prompt questions about why such a junior person had been assigned to work with elite units. Questions that could expose the classified nature of her previous work. The radios were returned to service just as the first VIP vehicle approached the base. Through the communications center window, Olivia watched the convoy of black SUVs navigate the mountain road. Colonel Blackwell had mentioned important visitors, but the level of security suggested these weren't ordinary military observers. "Form up for demonstration," Reynolds commanded, and the combat teams assembled at the 1,000-meter range. Olivia remained at her station, but she could see everything from her position. The VIP group included Pentagon officials, defense contractors, and what appeared to be foreign military attaches. The demonstration began routinely enough. Experienced operators coordinated impressive fire missions at challenging distances, showcasing the regiment's training effectiveness. But as the range extended to 2,500 meters and beyond, problems began to emerge. The atmospheric conditions that had plagued equipment all morning were equally challenging for long-range operations. Wind patterns were chaotic. Humidity was creating optical distortions, and temperature gradients were affecting both radio signals and projectile trajectories in unpredictable ways. Even skilled operators were struggling to maintain accuracy. Olivia watched with growing concern as fire mission after fire mission missed their intended targets. The VIPs were taking notes, their expressions increasingly skeptical. This was supposed to be a showcase of American military excellence, but it was turning into an embarrassing display of environmental limitations. "This is a disaster," Mira whispered, joining Olivia at the communication center window. "Those Pentagon people are going to think our regiment is incompetent." Olivia said nothing, but her analytical mind was working furiously. She could see patterns in the misses that revealed the environmental factors affecting each fire mission. Wind velocity was varying dramatically at different altitudes across the valley. Temperature layers were creating invisible barriers that deflected both signals and projectiles. The operators were using standard calculations that couldn't account for such complex atmospheric conditions. Lieutenant Rodriguez appeared beside her, his voice tight with stress. "Check every radio again. Make sure there are no equipment issues causing these misses." "The equipment is functioning perfectly," Olivia replied quietly. "The problem isn't mechanical." "Then what is it?" Rodriguez demanded. "These are expert operators. They don't just start missing routine targets." Olivia hesitated. Explaining what she observed would require revealing knowledge that went far beyond her supposed experience level. But watching American military capability being questioned by foreign observers was painful beyond endurance. "The atmospheric conditions are extremely challenging," she said carefully. "Multiple wind layers, temperature gradients, humidity variations. Standard calculation methods might not be sufficient." Rodriguez stared at her incredulously. "Are you seriously suggesting that our certified fire coordinators don't know how to read weather conditions?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Olivia replied. "I'm just observing that the environmental factors are more complex than usual." "Observing," Rodriguez repeated mockingly. "Right. A communications technician is going to teach expert operators about atmospheric conditions. Stay in your lane, Chen." But as the demonstration continued, the problems only worsened. A Navy SEAL instructor missed a target at 2,800 meters by more than 60 meters. An Army Ranger veteran struggled to coordinate effective fire beyond 3,000 meters. The VIPs were whispering among themselves, clearly unimpressed by what they were witnessing. Olivia felt physically ill watching the display. These were capable operators being defeated by conditions she could read and compensate for, but protocol demanded she remain silent while American military reputation suffered. "This is painful to watch," Mira murmured. "Is there anything you can do?" "Not without violating direct orders," Olivia replied, though every instinct screamed at her to intervene. The breaking point came when Major Reynolds himself took position for a demonstration fire mission at 3,500 meters. As operations officer, his performance would either salvage the demonstration or confirm the VIP's worst impressions. The target was challenging but achievable for someone of his caliber under normal conditions. Olivia could see immediately that he was making the same mistake as the others, relying on calculated adjustments instead of reading the actual environmental conditions. The wind wasn't consistent, the humidity was layered, and thermal effects were creating invisible currents that would push his shells significantly off course. Reynolds called in the fire mission. The artillery fired. The shells missed by nearly 100 meters, striking ground well left of the target. The silence that followed was deafening. Several VIPs shook their heads in disappointment. One of the foreign attaches made notes with obvious satisfaction. "Equipment malfunction," Reynolds announced, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll investigate and reschedule the demonstration." But Olivia could see in his eyes that he knew the equipment was functioning perfectly. The problem was human, not mechanical, and that made it infinitely more embarrassing. As the VIP group departed, their unimpressed expressions spoke volumes about the demonstration's impact. Olivia remained at her station, watching American military prestige drive away in black SUVs while she possessed the knowledge that could have prevented the disaster. That evening, the mood in the mess hall was somber. Word of the failed demonstration had spread throughout the base, and morale was suffering. The officers sat apart from the enlisted personnel, their usual confidence replaced by defensive frustration. "I don't understand what happened out there," Cooper said to his tablemates. "Reynolds is one of the best operators I've ever seen. He shouldn't miss targets like that." "Maybe the equipment really was malfunctioning," Garcia suggested hopefully. "Or maybe the conditions were just impossible," Murphy added. "Some days the mountain wins." Olivia listened to the speculation while reviewing weather data from the demonstration. The conditions had been challenging but not impossible. She'd seen Sullivan make similar calls under worse circumstances using techniques that most modern operators had forgotten in their reliance on technology. "You look like you have thoughts about today," Mira observed quietly. "Everyone has thoughts about today," Olivia replied. But she was thinking about something Sullivan had told her once. "The best operators don't fight the environment. They dance with it." When you stop calculating and start feeling, impossible missions become inevitable. That night, Olivia made a decision that would define the rest of her time at Forward Resolute. She couldn't directly challenge the officers or violate the chain of command, but she could prepare for the moment when her knowledge might be desperately needed. She began developing detailed environmental analysis techniques specifically adapted to the mountain's unique conditions. Not to share with anyone, but to be ready if opportunity arose. Because she was beginning to suspect that FOB Resolute was building towards something much more significant than routine training. And when that moment came, she intended to be ready to prove that excellence wasn't born from regulations and protocol. It was forged by people who understood that expertise couldn't be confined by rank or recognition. The storm that had been building over FOB Resolute finally broke on a grim morning in Olivia's 7th week. She arrived at the communications center to find Lieutenant Rodriguez waiting with a folder in his hands and an expression that promised trouble. "Chen," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your performance." Olivia set down her equipment bag and faced him calmly. "Is there a problem with my work, sir?" Rodriguez opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be official documentation. "That depends on how you define your work. According to multiple reports, you've been making unauthorized modifications to communications equipment, providing unsolicited tactical advice, and generally overstepping your assigned duties. I've been performing maintenance as requested." Olivia replied carefully. "If specific procedures weren't appropriate, I'd appreciate clarification." "Clarification?" Rodriguez's voice rose slightly. "How about this for clarification? Your communications personnel. Your job is to monitor radio traffic and maintain equipment logs. It is not to redesign frequency modulators, adjust signal propagation, or whatever other technical wizardry you've been performing." Olivia felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood settling on her shoulders. "The modifications I've made were necessary to correct manufacturing defects and environmental factors that affected performance." Every change was documented and improved operational capability. Improved performance, Rodriguez repeated mockingly. Right. A communications grunt with basic technical training is going to improve systems that certified engineers have already approved for service. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Blackwell, who strode into the communications center with obvious purpose. His expression was grim, and Olivia noticed he was carrying a classified folder marked with security stamps. She recognized from her previous assignment. "Rodriguez," the colonel said curtly, "I need to speak with Chen privately." Rodriguez looked surprised but nodded and left the area. Olivia remained at attention, uncertain what to expect, but sensing that something significant was about to change. Colonel Blackwell studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've been reviewing your personnel file, Chen. Interesting reading." "Yes, sir," Olivia replied, though she wondered exactly what version of her file the colonel had accessed. "Your previous commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, had some very specific things to say about your capabilities. Things that don't quite match your official job description." Olivia's pulse quickened. Colonel Harrison had overseen her work with Sullivan and the other special operations teams. If he'd been contacted, it meant someone was digging deeper. Then routine background checks. "He mentioned," the colonel continued, "that you were instrumental in achieving several remarkable mission successes at your previous assignment. Successes that required, and I quote, extraordinary technical expertise and environmental analysis capabilities." The words hung in the air between them. Olivia remained silent, uncertain how much the colonel knew or suspected. "He also mentioned," Blackwell added, "that regulatory limitations prevented official recognition of your contributions. Something about physical requirements and classification protocols." Now Olivia understood. Her background was being exposed, but in a way that might actually help rather than hurt her position. "Yes, sir. I worked as technical support for advanced special operations training." "Technical support," the colonel repeated. That's an interesting way to describe what Colonel Harrison called the most gifted environmental analyst he'd encountered in 30 years of service. The revelation hit Olivia like a physical blow. Harrison had never told her he held such a high opinion of her capabilities. During their 3 years working together, he'd been professional but distant, rarely acknowledging her contributions beyond routine performance evaluations. "Sir, let me finish," Blackwell interrupted. "Yesterday's demonstration was an embarrassment to this facility and to American military capability. Experienced operators missing routine targets while foreign observers took notes. It was unacceptable." Olivia nodded, remembering her frustration at watching preventable failures unfold. "What makes it even more unacceptable," the colonel continued, "is the possibility that we had someone on base who could have prevented those failures, but who was being wasted on routine communications duties because nobody bothered to look beyond her official job description." The implication was clear, but Olivia wasn't sure how to respond. Admitting her capabilities would confirm that she'd been concealing relevant experience. Denying them would perpetuate the misunderstanding that was limiting her contribution. "I have relevant experience in environmental analysis for long-range operations," she said carefully. "But I understand my current assignment and have been fulfilling those duties to the best of my ability." Blackwell nodded approvingly. Diplomatic answer. "But diplomacy isn't what we need right now." He opened his classified folder and withdrew several documents. "We're planning something that will make yesterday's demonstration look like basic training. An operation that will either restore confidence in this regiment's capabilities or confirm our critics' worst assumptions about our effectiveness." Olivia waited, sensing that something momentous was about to be revealed. "Operation Mountain Shadow," Blackwell announced. "A precision strike against an enemy installation positioned at extreme range under the most challenging conditions we can imagine." Olivia's breath caught. This sounded like the kind of operation Sullivan had specialized in, the kind where her environmental analysis had often made the difference between success and disaster. "We're expecting the same VIP group back in 2 weeks," the colonel continued, "along with Joint Chiefs representatives, defense contractors, and military leadership from 5 allied nations. One operation at maximum range with full telemetry and verification. Who will be coordinating the operation?" Olivia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's the question," Blackwell replied grimly. "Reynolds is our most experienced operations officer, but yesterday's performance has shaken his confidence. The other qualified operators are equally affected by the demonstration failure. We need someone who can coordinate an impossible operation under impossible pressure." Olivia said nothing, but her mind was already analyzing the challenge. Extreme range and mountain conditions with international observers witnessing every detail. The atmospheric factors alone would be staggering. Multiple wind layers, temperature gradients, humidity variations, and thermal effects that standard calculations couldn't account for. "There's something else," the colonel added. "Intelligence suggests that one of our supposed allies is planning to document our failure for propaganda purposes. They want to demonstrate that American military capability is inferior to their own systems." The stakes were becoming clear. This wasn't just about a training exercise. It was about national prestige and military reputation on an international stage. "I want you to work with Reynolds on environmental analysis for the operation," Blackwell commanded. "Use whatever expertise you've been hiding to help him succeed. This is bigger than protocols or job descriptions." Olivia felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that her capabilities were finally being recognized, anxiety about the enormous pressure, and anger that it had taken a crisis to reveal what should have been obvious from the beginning. "I'll do everything I can to help," she said quietly. "Good," Blackwell replied. "But understand this, failure is not an option. American military credibility is on the line. If we can't execute this operation perfectly, our enemies will use that failure for years to come." As the colonel left, Olivia remained at her station, staring out at the distant mountains that had suddenly become the center of her world. Miles of turbulent mountain air filled with invisible challenges that could deflect even perfect calculations. But for the first time since arriving at Forward Resolute, she felt something approaching hope. Not because the challenge was easy, but because someone finally understood that she possessed the knowledge necessary to meet it. The question wasn't whether the operation could succeed. Sullivan had taught her that any mission was possible with sufficient understanding of environmental conditions. The question was whether Reynolds could execute techniques that required abandoning conventional methodology in favor of intuitive environmental reading. That night, Olivia began the most intensive preparation of her career. Not for her own performance, but to transfer knowledge that might determine America's reputation in the eyes of the world. She had 2 weeks to teach Reynolds what had taken her 3 years to learn. 2 weeks to turn an impossible operation into an inevitable one. The mountain winds seemed to whisper approval as she worked, as if nature itself understood that something significant was about to unfold. Something that would prove excellence wasn't born from equipment or regulations, but from the marriage of human expertise and environmental understanding. Olivia Chen was about to discover whether her years of invisible contribution had prepared her for the moment when invisibility was no longer an option. Olivia's first training session with Major Reynolds began at dawn the next morning, away from the main operations center where other officers couldn't observe. Colonel Blackwell had made it clear that her involvement was to remain unofficial until after the operation. Too many egos were at stake to admit that a communications specialist was providing tactical guidance to the regiment's senior operations officer. "Let's get something straight," Reynolds said as they approached the observation point. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I don't need basic operational lessons from someone who's never held a combat qualification. Olivia nodded respectfully. I understand, sir. I'm here to provide environmental analysis support, not operational instruction. Good, Reynolds replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced this arrangement would work. Show me what you think you know about atmospheric conditions. Olivia had spent the previous night preparing for this moment. She'd analyzed weather patterns for the past month, studying how mountain conditions affected long-range operations. Her notebook contained detailed observations about wind layers, temperature gradients, and humidity variations that most operators never considered. The key challenge at extreme range isn't distance, she began carefully. It's the atmospheric complexity between here and the target. Standard calculation methods assume consistent conditions along the projectile path, but that assumption breaks. Down in mountains, Reynolds looked skeptical but gestured for her to continue. Wind velocity varies significantly at different altitudes, Olivia explained, pointing toward the distant ridgelines. What we feel here at the base might be completely different 500 meters downrange, and different again at 2,000 meters. I know about wind reading, Reynolds interrupted. Every operator learns to observe terrain indicators and adjust accordingly. Yes, sir, Olivia agreed. But terrain indicators only show surface conditions. At extreme range, we need to read atmospheric layers that aren't visible from ground level. She opened her notebook and showed Reynolds diagrams she'd created. During her years with Sullivan, complex charts showing how temperature differentials created invisible air currents, how humidity formed barriers that could deflect projectiles, how thermal effects from sun-warmed slopes created updrafts and downdrafts that affected trajectories. Reynolds studied the diagrams with growing interest. Where did you learn this? Level of atmospheric analysis? Olivia chose her words carefully. My previous assignment involved supporting advanced special operations training. I worked with teams that specialized in extreme range operations. Teams like who? Reynolds pressed. Captain Michael Sullivan's unit, Olivia replied, watching Reynolds's expression change immediately. Sullivan? Reynolds's voice carried new respect. You worked with Mike Sullivan? He's legendary. Nobody's ever matched his operational success rate under extreme conditions. I provided technical support for his training program, Olivia confirmed, not mentioning that she'd been the person who made those legendary successes possible. Reynolds's entire demeanor shifted. If she'd worked with Sullivan, her credentials were unquestionable. Sullivan's reputation in the special operations community was beyond dispute, and anyone he trusted for technical support must possess exceptional capabilities. What did Sullivan teach you about environmental reading? Reynolds asked, his previous skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Olivia felt a moment of emotional pain remembering her mentor. Sullivan had died in a covert operation 6 months after her transfer, taking with him knowledge that existed nowhere else in the military. His techniques had died with him, except for what he'd taught her during their 3 years together. He taught me that environmental conditions aren't obstacles to overcome, she said quietly. They're information to be read and utilized. When you stop fighting the atmosphere and start dancing with it, impossible operations become predictable. Dancing with it, Reynolds repeated. That sounds like Sullivan. He always said fieldcraft was more art than science at extreme ranges. Olivia nodded. He believed that technology could only take you so far. Beyond conventional ranges, success depends on intuitive understanding of how air moves and changes. Over the following days, Olivia began sharing techniques that hadn't been documented in any manual. Methods Sullivan had developed through decades of experience, refined through countless operations under impossible conditions. She taught Reynolds to read thermal shimmer patterns that revealed air density changes. She showed him how to interpret cloud formations that indicated high-altitude wind patterns. She explained how to feel atmospheric pressure changes that affected both communications and targeting. "This is incredible," Reynolds admitted after a week of intensive training. "I've been operating for 15 years, and I'm learning things I never knew existed." But as their sessions continued, Olivia began to notice a troubling pattern. Reynolds was absorbing the theoretical knowledge quickly, but translating it into practical application was proving difficult. The intuitive aspects that came naturally to her remained foreign to his methodical, technology-dependent approach. "I understand what you're telling me," he said during one particularly frustrating session. "But when I'm coordinating, I keep reverting to calculated adjustments instead of feeling the conditions." Olivia watched him struggle with growing concern. Reynolds was a skilled operator using conventional methods, but extreme-range operations required abandoning conventional thinking. They demanded the kind of environmental intuition that took years to develop, and they had less than a week remaining. "Maybe we need to approach this differently," she suggested. "Instead of trying to change your entire methodology, what if we combined your technical skills with environmental analysis?" "How do you mean?" Olivia had been considering this possibility since their training began. "What if I served as your environmental analyst for the operation? I could provide real-time atmospheric readings while you focused on execution." Reynolds looked intrigued but uncertain. "Analysts are usually qualified operators themselves. You don't have official combat training." "No," Olivia agreed. "But I have 3 years of experience reading atmospheric conditions for extreme-range operations." Sullivan's team members were all qualified operators, but I was the one who provided environmental analysis that made his impossible missions possible. The admission hung between them. Olivia had just revealed more about her previous role than she'd intended, but desperation was overriding caution. "You were Sullivan's environmental analyst?" Reynolds asked with growing amazement. "The person who calculated conditions for his record operations?" Olivia nodded, feeling the weight of secrets finally being acknowledged. Official records credit him and his team with those achievements, and rightfully so. They were the ones who executed the missions, but the environmental analysis that made those missions possible came from techniques we developed together. Reynolds stared at her with new understanding. "That's why your atmospheric knowledge is so advanced. You weren't just supporting advanced training. You were enabling legendary achievements." "I was part of a team," Olivia corrected. "Sullivan was the legend. I just helped him understand what the air was doing." But even as she spoke, Olivia was beginning to realize something that would change everything. Reynolds was a competent operator, but he wasn't Sullivan. He didn't possess the intuitive brilliance that had made Sullivan legendary, and no amount of training could create that kind of natural ability. The operation was in 5 days, and international observers would be watching America's military capability through the scope of a single mission. If Reynolds failed, the consequences would extend far beyond personal embarrassment. That night, alone in her quarters, Olivia faced a possibility that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. What if the operation couldn't be coordinated effectively by Reynolds, regardless of her environmental support? What if the only way to succeed was for someone with true atmospheric intuition to take control themselves? The regulations were clear about who could participate in official operations. She didn't have the physical qualifications, the combat certification, or the rank necessary for such a role. But she had something more important, the knowledge and instinct necessary to coordinate an impossible operation under impossible conditions. As mountain winds whispered through her window, Olivia began to consider a course of action that would either save American military prestige or end her career in disgrace. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by people nobody expected to fight them. And sometimes excellence emerged from the shadows where it had been hiding all along. The morning of Operation Mountain Shadow dawned gray and turbulent, with mountain winds that made Olivia's heart sink. She arrived at the operations center 2 hours before the scheduled demonstration to find Reynolds already there, staring at the tactical display with visible anxiety. "How are the conditions?" she asked, though she could already see the challenges they faced. "Terrible," Reynolds replied grimly. "Crosswinds, temperature gradients, humidity variations, everything we trained for, but worse." Olivia studied the environmental factors with growing concern. Trees at different elevations, swaying in conflicting directions, indicating complex wind patterns. Heat shimmer created optical distortions that would make target acquisition difficult. Cloud formations suggested high-altitude air currents that would affect trajectories unpredictably. "We can work with these conditions," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Remember what we practiced about reading thermal layers." But as the VIP convoy arrived, Olivia sensed Reynolds's nervousness was approaching panic. The international observers included military attaches from 6 nations, Pentagon officials, and defense contractors whose opinions would influence future funding decisions. The pressure was enormous, and Reynolds was visibly struggling under its weight. Colonel Blackwell approached their position as the observation area filled with dignitaries. "How are we looking?" he asked quietly. "Challenging conditions," Olivia replied diplomatically, "but manageable with proper analysis." Blackwell nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely reassured. "Reynolds, you ready for this?" "Yes, sir," Reynolds answered, though his voice lacked conviction. As the formal presentation began, Olivia positioned herself beside Reynolds at the operations center. She'd spent the previous week developing techniques for providing real-time atmospheric data during extreme-range operations, methods that went far beyond standard analytical procedures. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Blackwell announced to the assembled observers, "today's operation represents the pinnacle of American long-range precision capability. The target is positioned at extreme distance, a range that challenges the limits of both human skill and military technology." Olivia felt the weight of international attention focusing on their position. Through the observation window, she could see foreign military officers taking detailed notes, clearly hoping to document American failure for their own purposes. "Major Reynolds will be coordinating the operation," Blackwell continued, "with environmental analysis support from our technical specialist." Several observers looked in Olivia's direction with obvious skepticism. Her small stature and communications insignia didn't match their expectations for operation support personnel. "Wind analysis," Olivia whispered to Reynolds as he settled into position. "Surface wind from the northwest at 12 miles per hour, but there's a thermal gradient at 1,500 meters creating cross-currents." Reynolds nodded and made his initial adjustments, but Olivia could see tension in his body language that would affect his judgment. The pressure of international observation was overwhelming his training. "Humidity barrier at 2,500 meters, she continued, reading atmospheric conditions that were invisible to everyone else present. "Adjust elevation parameters to compensate for air density changes." Reynolds made the correction, but his movements were mechanical rather than intuitive. He was following her instructions rather than feeling the environmental conditions himself, creating a dangerous disconnect between analysis and execution. "Take your time," Olivia advised. "The conditions are complex but readable. Trust the environmental data." But as Reynolds prepared to initiate the operation, Olivia noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the foreign observers had produced a high-end camera with a telephoto lens, positioning himself to document the operations center in detail. If Reynolds failed, the photographs would be used for propaganda purposes worldwide. "Thermal updraft from the south slope," she whispered urgently. "Adjust targeting parameters to compensate." Reynolds made the adjustment and initiated the operation. The artillery fired. The shell's flight time at extreme range seemed eternal. For nearly 20 seconds, everyone watched and waited while the projectiles traveled through miles of turbulent mountain air. Olivia held her breath, calculating trajectory factors in her mind, knowing that dozens of variables could cause failure. The radio crackled with spotting information. No impact observed. Repeat, no impact on target. Silence fell over the observation area like a funeral shroud. Reynolds had missed completely, his coordinated fire disappearing into the mountainside. Beyond the target, the failure was total and public, witnessed by international observers who were already making notes about American military inadequacy. Equipment malfunction, Colonel Blackwell announced quickly, though everyone present knew the systems had functioned perfectly. Olivia felt physically sick, watching American prestige crumble in real time. Foreign officers were smiling with satisfaction, having witnessed exactly what they'd hoped to see. Defense contractors were shaking their heads, questioning investments in American military programs. Second attempt authorized, Blackwell declared. No regulations typically allowed only one demonstration, but Olivia could see that Reynolds was devastated by the miss. His confidence was shattered, his hands were shaking, and his breathing was irregular. A second attempt under these conditions would likely be even worse than the first. "I can't do this," Reynolds whispered to her. "The pressure is too much. I'm second-guessing every adjustment." Olivia looked at the assembled observers, at the cameras documenting American failure, at the foreign attaches who would carry news of this disaster back to their governments. Everything she'd worked for, everything Sullivan had taught her was being discredited because regulations prevented the right person from taking control. "Sir," she said quietly to Colonel Blackwell as he approached their position, "I need to speak with you privately." Blackwell looked confused but followed her away from the operations center. "What is it, Chen?" "Reynolds can't coordinate this operation," she said bluntly. "He's a skilled operator, but not under this level of pressure with these atmospheric conditions." "Are you suggesting we cancel the demonstration?" Blackwell asked incredulously. "No, sir," Olivia replied, her heart pounding with the audacity of what she was about to propose. "I'm suggesting that someone else should coordinate the operation." "Someone else? Who?" "Reynolds is our most qualified operations officer." Olivia took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save the operation or end her military career. "Someone who has the environmental analysis capability necessary to coordinate this operation without an analyst." Blackwell stared at her with growing understanding. "You're talking about yourself." "Yes, sir," Olivia confirmed. "I know the regulations about physical requirements and combat qualifications, but I also know that American military credibility is being destroyed while we have someone present who can make this operation succeed." "Chen, you're not qualified for—" "Sir," Olivia interrupted. "I've been making operations like this possible for 3 years. The only difference is that now I'm asking to coordinate myself instead of telling someone else how to do it." "Colonel." Blackwell looked toward the observation area where foreign officers were clearly enjoying American embarrassment. His jaw tightened as he weighed regulations against results, protocol against national prestige. "If you fail," he said quietly, "this becomes an even bigger disaster. A communications technician failing after a senior operations officer already failed." "If I fail," Olivia replied, "we're no worse off than we are now. But if I succeed, we demonstrate that American military capability extends beyond conventional expectations." Blackwell studied her face for a long moment, searching for confidence or competence that regulations said shouldn't exist. What he saw there apparently convinced him that desperate times required desperate measures. "One attempt," he said finally. "If you fail, I'll take full responsibility for the decision. If you succeed, the credit goes to innovative training methods and environmental analysis techniques." Olivia nodded, understanding that success would be attributed to institutional capability, while failure would be blamed on individual incompetence. But personal recognition had never been her motivation. "I'll need 15 minutes to analyze current conditions and make equipment adjustments," she said. "Take whatever time you need," Blackwell replied. "At this point, we have nothing left to lose." As Olivia returned to the operations center, she felt the weight of international attention shifting to her small frame. Foreign observers were whispering among themselves, clearly amused that a communications technician was attempting what an experienced operations officer had failed to achieve. But Olivia was no longer thinking about observers or consequences. She was entering the mental state Sullivan had taught her, where external pressure disappeared and only environmental conditions mattered. The mountain was speaking to her through wind patterns and thermal currents, and she was ready to listen. Miles of turbulent air lay between her and a target that would determine American military reputation for years to come. But for the first time since arriving at FOB Resolute, Olivia felt completely at peace. She was finally in her element. Olivia approached the operations console with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. The international observers watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright mockery as the small communications technician prepared to attempt what their experienced operations officer had failed to achieve. "This should be interesting," she heard one of the foreign attaches mutter in accented English. "Americans so desperate they're using support personnel for critical operations." Olivia ignored the commentary and began her environmental analysis. This wasn't about proving herself to skeptical observers. It was about reading miles of mountain atmosphere with the precision necessary to make an impossible operation inevitable. She started by studying vegetation movement at various distances, noting how trees and underbrush swayed differently at specific elevations. The wind wasn't consistent. It rarely was in mountains, but it was readable. Surface winds from the northwest at 12 miles per hour. Thermal currents from the sun-warmed south slope creating cross winds at 1,500 meters. High-altitude patterns indicated by cloud movement, suggesting downdrafts beyond 3,000 meters. "What is she doing?" one of the Pentagon officials asked Colonel Blackwell. "Environmental analysis," Blackwell replied, though his own understanding of Olivia's methods was limited. "Calculating atmospheric factors that affect long-range operations." Olivia pulled out her notebook and began making calculations. Formulas that drew amazed stares from observers accustomed to sophisticated electronic equipment. Temperature gradients, humidity variations, barometric pressure changes, all translated into precise mathematical adjustments using techniques Sullivan had taught her years ago. "She's using manual calculations," a defense contractor observed with obvious skepticism. "No targeting computer, no meteorological sensors, no atmospheric modeling system. This is primitive methodology." But Olivia was operating on a level beyond their comprehension. The electronic equipment they considered essential was designed for standard conditions and predictable environments. Mountain operations at extreme range required understanding nuances that computers couldn't quantify: how thermal layers created invisible barriers, how humidity formed pockets of dense air that could deflect projectiles, how microscopic pressure changes affected trajectories in ways that equations couldn't capture. 15 minutes passed as she studied conditions with the intensity of a scientist examining a complex equation. Every tree movement, every thermal shimmer, every cloud formation provided data about atmospheric behavior along the projectile's path. "Wind speed varies at different altitudes," she murmured to herself, making final calculations. Temperature gradient creates density barriers at 2,500 meters. Humidity forms a deflection zone at 3,200 meters. Thermal updraft from the south slope affects trajectory after 3,000 meters. The observers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether they were witnessing expertise or elaborate pretense. Several foreign officers were taking detailed notes, apparently planning to document American military desperation for intelligence purposes. Olivia settled into position at the operations console, adjusting the targeting parameters with microscopic precision. At extreme range, the target area was barely visible, even with maximum magnification. A compound that appeared as little more than a distant speck through atmospheric distortion. "No analyst support," observed one of the military attaches. "This is highly irregular procedure." "She doesn't need an analyst," Reynolds said quietly, speaking for the first time since his failed attempt. "She's reading conditions that most of us can't even see." Olivia's breathing settled into the controlled rhythm Sullivan had taught her. Heartbeat steady, muscle tension minimal, mental focus absolute. The external pressure of international observation faded away as she entered the meditative state necessary for extreme range operations. Through the tactical display, she could see heat shimmer distorting the target image. Crosswinds at multiple altitudes would push the projectiles in different directions during their flight. Humidity would create drag coefficients that changed along the trajectory. Temperature variations would affect air density in ways that standard calculations couldn't predict. But Olivia wasn't relying on standard calculations. She was using intuitive understanding developed through 3 years of making impossible operations possible for Sullivan. Environmental reading that transcended mathematics. Atmospheric awareness that operated below conscious thought. She made final targeting adjustments based on conditions only she could perceive. Wind drift compensation for cross-currents at 1,700 meters. Elevation correction for thermal barriers at 2,800 meters. Trajectory adjustment for high-altitude downdrafts beyond 3,000 meters. The operations console settled into perfect readiness as Olivia prepared for the coordination that would determine American military credibility in the eyes of the world. Miles of turbulent mountain air lay between her position and a target that would either validate her expertise or confirm every skeptic's worst assumptions. "Impossible conditions," muttered one of the foreign observers. "No one can make accurate calculations with so many atmospheric variables." But Olivia had stopped calculating. She was feeling the environment with senses developed through years of patient observation. The mountain was speaking to her through thermal currents and pressure changes, and she was listening with the focused attention Sullivan had taught her was essential for legendary achievements. 12 seconds of final environmental assessment. Wind patterns were stabilizing into readable configurations. Temperature gradients were creating predictable deflection zones. Humidity barriers were forming consistent density changes that could be compensated for with precise adjustments. Olivia initiated the operation with the calm confidence Sullivan had drilled into her. The artillery fired with controlled precision, sending their projectiles on a journey through hostile atmospheric conditions toward a target that represented American military reputation. The shell's flight time at extreme range created an eternity of silence. Foreign observers watched through binoculars, clearly expecting to document another American failure. Pentagon officials held their breath, knowing that careers and budgets depended on the next few seconds. Defense contractors calculated the cost of continued investment in military programs that might be fundamentally flawed. 20 seconds felt like 20 hours as the projectiles traveled through multiple wind layers, temperature gradients, and humidity variations that would challenge even perfect calculations. Olivia remained motionless at the console, her mind tracking the shell's probable path through atmospheric conditions she'd analyzed with methodical precision. Then the radio crackled with verification. Target struck. Repeat. Target struck center mass. Hit confirmed at extreme range. Direct hit. Complete silence followed the announcement. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke as the impossible became reality. The communications technician had achieved what the experienced operations officer could not, using manual calculations and environmental analysis techniques that seemed primitive compared to modern technology. She had coordinated a precision strike that traveled miles through turbulent mountain air to strike a target most observers couldn't even see clearly through their binoculars. Colonel Blackwell was the first to speak. "Outstanding coordination, Chen. Absolutely outstanding." But Olivia simply stood up, secured the console, and stepped back without celebration or emotional reaction. The operation had been successful because the environmental analysis was accurate, not because of individual heroics. She'd simply applied techniques Sullivan had taught her to conditions she understood better than anyone else present. The foreign observers who'd arrived hoping to document American failure now found themselves witnessing a demonstration of capability that exceeded their own military standards. The defense contractors who'd questioned program investments were suddenly taking notes about environmental analysis techniques they'd never considered. "How did she make those calculations without electronic assistance?" asked one of the Pentagon officials. "Experience," Reynolds replied, his voice filled with new respect. "She's been doing environmental analysis for extreme-range operations longer than most of us have been in the field." As word of the successful operation spread throughout FOB Resolute, the true magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in. A communications technician had broken the regiment's record by over 500 meters, using methods that challenged conventional understanding of long-range operations. But Olivia was already thinking beyond the demonstration. The operation had been successful. American military credibility had been preserved, and techniques Sullivan had developed were finally receiving recognition they deserved. Her personal vindication was less important than proving that human expertise could exceed technological limitations when properly applied. The mountain winds carried the scent of pine and the promise of storms ahead. But Olivia no longer feared atmospheric challenges. She had just proven that excellence wasn't created by equipment or regulations, but by people who understood that success emerged from the marriage of human intuition and environmental awareness. The impossible operation had become inevitable, just as Sullivan had always promised it would. The transformation at FOB Resolute began immediately after Olivia's achievement, but it wasn't the kind of change she had expected. Within hours, her personnel file was being reviewed by Pentagon officials, and by the next morning, military training programs from across the country were requesting copies of her environmental analysis techniques. Colonel Blackwell summoned her to his office 3 days after the demonstration, where she found him reviewing a stack of official communications that seemed to grow larger each hour. "Chen," he began, "I've received formal requests from 7 different military installations, asking for your transfer to their advanced operations programs. The Defense Department wants to incorporate your environmental analysis methods into standard tactical training, and 3 foreign militaries have inquired about training exchanges to study your techniques." Olivia sat quietly, unsurprised by the attention but uncertain how to respond to it. Recognition had never been her goal. Competence had always been sufficient. "There's also this," Blackwell continued, sliding a folder across his desk. "Recommendation for immediate promotion to captain, with assignment to the Advanced Tactical Research Division at Fort Bragg. Full recognition of your specialized expertise. Official combat qualification waiver, and research budget for developing environmental analysis protocols." Olivia opened the folder and scanned documents that would transform her from invisible support personnel to officially recognized specialist. Everything she'd worked toward for years, validated by a single impossible operation. "And if I prefer to remain here?" she asked quietly. Blackwell looked surprised. "Chen, this is a career-making opportunity. You'd be working with the military's most elite operational programs, developing techniques that could revolutionize tactical training." "I understand the significance," Olivia replied. "But I'm more interested in individual instruction than institutional development." What she didn't say was that fame and recognition felt foreign after years of deliberate invisibility. The techniques she'd used came from Sullivan's teaching, refined through patient observation and dedicated practice. Turning them into bureaucratic training protocols seemed like a betrayal of their essential nature. "At least consider the offers," Blackwell urged. "Your expertise is too valuable to waste on routine communications duties." Olivia nodded politely, but her mind was already made up. She'd proven her capabilities to herself and demonstrated that American military excellence remained world-class. Personal advancement was less important than continuing the work Sullivan had started. Over the following weeks, the story of her achievement grew beyond anything she could have anticipated. Military publications described her as the communications technician who redefined extreme-range operations. Defense contractors studied her manual calculation methods, trying to incorporate human environmental intuition into electronic systems. Foreign observers who'd hoped to document American failure instead found themselves requesting information about training techniques they couldn't replicate. But the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers at Forward Resolute, who began seeking her guidance with genuine respect instead of dismissive tolerance. Cooper approached her during communications duty one morning, his previous swagger replaced by humble curiosity. "Olivia," he said, using her first name for the first time since her arrival, "would you be willing to teach me some of your environmental reading techniques? I keep thinking about that operation, and I realize I don't understand the first thing about atmospheric analysis." "Of course," she replied, pleased that someone wanted to learn rather than simply benefit from her expertise. Mira joined them, having requested transfer to the operations program specifically to study under Olivia's guidance. "I've been documenting your environmental reading analysis methods," she said. "Would you mind reviewing my notes to make sure I'm understanding the principles correctly?" As word spread, Olivia found herself teaching informal classes to small groups of interested soldiers. Not formal instruction that would violate protocols, but mentorship sessions that focused on environmental awareness and atmospheric understanding. Students who'd struggled with conventional methods discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed when they learned to read conditions instead of calculating them. The most significant change occurred among the officers themselves. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who'd been her harshest critic, approached her with unexpected humility 3 weeks after the demonstration. "Chen," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about your capabilities, and my skepticism nearly cost us a critical operation. I'd like to learn from you, if you're willing to teach." Olivia nodded, appreciating the courage it had taken for him to admit his mistake. Everyone learns at their own pace. What matters is being open to new methods when conventional approaches aren't sufficient. Reynolds became her strongest advocate, crediting her with teaching him environmental awareness techniques that had improved his own operational effectiveness dramatically. "She made me understand that fieldcraft at extreme range is more about reading conditions than operating equipment," he told anyone who would listen. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in an unexpected form. 6 months after the demonstration, Olivia received a letter forwarded through military channels. The return address showed it was from Sullivan's widow, whom she'd never met, but who had somehow learned about the record operation. "Dear Olivia," the letter began, "I wanted you to know how proud Michael would be of your achievement. He often spoke about the technical specialist who made his impossible operations possible, though he never mentioned your name due to classification requirements. He said you understood atmospheric conditions better than anyone he'd ever worked with, and that your expertise would someday receive the recognition it deserved. I'm glad that day has finally come." The letter continued with personal details about Sullivan's final months, including his regret that military regulations had prevented official acknowledgement of Olivia's contributions. He said the greatest warriors were often invisible, the letter concluded, but that invisibility didn't diminish their importance. Thank you for carrying on his work." Olivia read the letter 3 times, feeling emotion she'd suppressed for years finally finding expression. Sullivan had recognized her value even when she doubted it herself, and his confidence in her abilities had ultimately proven justified. A year after the demonstration, FOB Resolute had become the military's premier environmental operations training facility. Students came from around the world to study techniques that emphasized human intuition over technological dependence. The regiment's reputation for producing exceptional operators was built on principles Olivia had introduced, though she insisted on remaining officially unofficial in her teaching role. "Why don't you accept formal recognition?" Mira asked during one of their evening conversations. "You've revolutionized how the military approaches extreme range operations." "Because formal recognition changes the nature of the work," Olivia replied. "When expertise becomes institutional, it often loses the personal connection that makes it effective. I'd rather remain available for individual instruction than become part of a bureaucratic training system." The regiment's extreme range capabilities were no longer considered impossible. Several students had achieved operational success at those distances, using techniques Olivia had taught them, proving that her methods could be transferred to others with sufficient dedication. But Olivia's greatest satisfaction came from watching formerly struggling operators discover their own capabilities through environmental awareness training. Soldiers who'd been ready to quit advanced programs found new confidence when they learned to trust their observational skills instead of relying solely on technological assistance. Late one evening, as mountain winds whispered through her quarters, Olivia reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible support personnel to reluctant legend. The record operation had validated her expertise, but more importantly, it had created opportunities to share knowledge that might otherwise have died with Sullivan. She thought about the students who would carry these techniques to new assignments, spreading environmental awareness throughout military communities. The expertise that had once existed only in classified programs was now becoming standard training, ensuring that future generations of operators would understand the marriage of human intuition and atmospheric science. True excellence, Olivia had learned, wasn't measured in personal achievements or official recognition. It was found in the capabilities she developed in others, the confidence she helped them discover, and the skills they would pass on long after her own career ended. The mountain held its secrets close, but it also shared them with those patient enough to listen. Olivia had learned to speak its language, and now she was teaching others to hear its voice. In a world increasingly dependent on technology, she was proof that human expertise remained irreplaceable when properly developed and applied. Some legends were uniforms covered with ribbons and medals. Others were communications insignia and carried simple notebooks. Both changed the world in meaningful ways, but only one asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to perfect skills that saved lives when conventional methods failed. As sleep approached, Olivia smiled at the pure irony of her situation. She'd spent years being underestimated because she didn't fit anyone's idea of what a combat operator should look like. Now she was training people who would achieve their own impossible operations using techniques she'd developed in shadow. The greatest achievements, she understood now, often came from people nobody noticed until the critical moment when everything depended on them. And the most important victories were measured not in personal glory, but in the quiet satisfaction of excellence shared with those ready to receive it. Wind doesn't demand gratitude, she thought, remembering Sullivan's words from years earlier. It just needs someone listening carefully. That was the essential lesson he had taught her, and the wisdom she would continue sharing with anyone willing to learn. Outside her window, the mountain peak stood silent against the star-filled sky, keeping watch over a base where impossible had become inevitable through the patient application of human expertise. And somewhere in the darkness, those distant Observation posts waited for the next student, ready to discover that excellence wasn't born from equipment or regulations, but from the courage to trust capabilities others couldn't see. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become part of our everyday inspiration community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us